Her small hands shook as they desperately grabbed the fabric of the man's jacket. Unstoppable tears carved clean paths through the grime on her face, and her voice was a ragged whisper, breaking on every syllable. "They are hurting my sister. She is going to die." A sudden, complete quiet descended upon the room. The gentle clinking of ice in whiskey glasses ceased. Every single person turned to stare. But the man she had pleaded with was not just any person. He was Dominic Caruso, the most dreaded mafia figure in all of Chicago, a man they called the Reaper. And what he chose to do in that moment was something no one present would ever be able to forget. You will want to stay with me for this entire story, because the conclusion will absolutely move you. This is more than a mafia story. This is a story about how one moment of desperate courage can crack open a heart that has been locked for 10 years. It is about the truth that sometimes the people who save us are the ones we least expect. You are about to witness how a 6-year-old girl with bare feet and a torn nightgown did what no one else in Chicago dared to do. She made the Reaper feel again. If you believe that even the coldest heart can be warmed by love, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Hit that like button if you are ready for a journey that will stay with you long after it ends. And share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to choose love over fear. Now let us go back to that freezing Tuesday night. It was a frigid Tuesday evening in the heart of downtown Chicago, in the year 2024. Inside the Velvet Crown restaurant, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the low murmur of powerful men finalizing deals over aged spirits. This was never just a restaurant. It was Dominic Caruso's sanctuary. Every employee there knew the first rule was to be deaf and mute. Every guest understood the code of conduct. You kept to your own affairs, you showed the proper deference, and you never, under any circumstances, brought trouble through his doors. Dominic Caruso occupied his customary corner booth in the exclusive VIP section, a man whose quiet presence alone could inspire both deep respect and primal fear. By the age of 36, he had methodically constructed a criminal enterprise that spanned 3 different states. His piercing, steel-gray eyes saw everything. His command was absolute law, and this evening, just like every Tuesday for the last decade, he was holding his weekly strategy session with his most trusted inner circle. Their discussion unfolded in hushed, deliberate tones. They reviewed figures, they allocated territories, and they solved problems with the detached precision of a surgeon. This was the essence of Dominic's method, always analytical, always calculated, and never allowing emotion to interfere with his judgment. He had outlasted nearly everyone in this brutal underworld because he lived by one unshakable truth. Feelings were a vulnerability, and any vulnerability would get you put in the ground. And then it happened. The single event that would tear down the emotional fortress Dominic had spent 10 years building around his soul. The restaurant's enormous heavy oak door was thrown open with a shocking amount of force, crashing loudly against the interior wall. Every single head in the establishment snapped toward the sound. Conversations halted abruptly. The restaurant manager scrambled forward, his face a mask of white, sheer panic. But before he could even begin to address the disturbance, everyone saw the source of the commotion. A very small girl, who could not have been older than 6, stood shivering in the entrance. She was wearing a flimsy nightgown that was both ripped and stained with filth. Blood, clearly not her own, was smeared across the delicate white cotton. Her dark brown hair was a tangled mess, framing a small face streaked with both tears and dirt. Her feet were bare, bright red from the biting cold of the pavement. She looked as though she had clawed her way through hell itself to arrive at this very spot. The child's gaze frantically scanned the room, a desperate search for anyone, for a sign of hope. The patrons of the Velvet Crown could only gape back, trapped in a stunned silence. A few looked away, deeply unsettled by the intrusion. Others began to whisper to each other, clearly irritated that their private evening had been interrupted by what they assumed was just another street urchin begging for change. But this little girl was not searching for spare change. She was searching for a miracle. Her desperate eyes finally settled on Dominic Caruso's table, and some deep, innocent part of her recognized absolute power when she saw it. Perhaps it was the almost reverential way the other men at the table deferred to him. It could have been the perfectly tailored suit, or the glint of the gold watch on his wrist. Or maybe it was something far more primal, a child's pure instinct, that pointed her directly to the one individual in that entire room who possessed the real power to change her fate. With no hesitation at all, she broke into a run, heading straight for him. A collective, silent gasp seemed to fill the room. Dominic's personal bodyguards immediately stiffened, their hands drifting instinctively toward the weapons concealed within their jackets. An event like this was completely unheard of. Nobody ever approached Dominic Caruso without an invitation, and certainly not like this. But before a single person could make a move, the little girl reached Dominic's table and seized the sleeve of his suit with both of her small hands. Her tiny fingers gripped the expensive material as if it were the only thing keeping her from drowning. And the blood on her hands, her dying sister's blood, left a dark, accusing stain on his cuff. Then, she spoke the words that would haunt Dominic's thoughts for all the years to come. "They are hurting my sister. She is dying. She is all I have in the world. Please, I am begging you, save her." The silence that came after her plea was so profound, it felt like a physical weight. You could have heard a whisper from across the entire restaurant. Every single person was focused on Dominic, waiting with bated breath to see how the infamous mob boss would react to this impossible situation. His entire reputation had been forged from being untouchable. He was known for being cold, a man who offered mercy to absolutely no one. Dominic gazed down at the small child clutching his arm. Her face was tilted up to meet his. Her large brown eyes were wide with a heartbreaking mix of terror and unwavering hope. In that single frozen moment, something inside the hardened criminal's chest fractured, a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience for a full decade. This little girl, she was the exact same age Sophia had been the very last time he saw her. 10 years prior, Dominic Caruso had been a completely different man. At 26 years old, he was already positioned deep within his father's organization, mastering the brutal business that had created their family's fortune. Yet, in spite of the constant darkness that defined his work, Dominic had two sources of pure light in his life: his mother, Isabella, and his 16-year-old sister, Sophia. Isabella Caruso possessed the kindest heart in a world filled with predators. At 52, she held on to the belief that her son would one day escape the criminal life. Every single Sunday, she would prepare pasta by hand, making the house smell of fresh garlic and rich tomato sauce, pretending, if only for an afternoon, that they were just a regular family. She never passed judgment. She never offered condemnation. Her love was simply unconditional and absolute. But it was Sophia who truly owned Dominic's heart. Sophia was 16 years old, with the very same warm brown eyes that Dominic now saw looking up at him from this desperate child's face. She was exceptionally smart, the valedictorian of her class, with ambitions of attending medical school. She was fiercely determined to become a doctor who saved lives, rather than one who took them. She was the single ray of light in a family consumed by shadows. She was the one truly innocent thing that Dominic would have done anything in the world to keep safe. Every single morning, regardless of how late his business had kept him out the night before, Dominic would drive Sophia to her school. And every afternoon, he was there to pick her up. He carefully vetted all of her friends, intimidated any boy who gave her a second glance, and worked tirelessly to ensure she remained ignorant of the true, violent nature of their family's enterprises. Sophia was destined for another kind of life, a much better life. He had promised her that, but promises are meaningless to men who crave only power. The Castellano family had been their bitter rivals for decades, clashing over territory, over illicit profits, and over simple pride. When peace talks finally collapsed, they chose to deliver a message, not to Dominic's father, but by striking at the one thing that could truly break him. They abducted Isabella and Sofia on a Wednesday night, taking them directly from the parking area of Sofia's high school. The ransom call came just a few hours later. The Castellanos demanded territory, a huge sum of money, and a public admission of defeat. Dominic pleaded with his father to pay them, to give them anything they asked for. But Antonio Caruso was a man ruled by principles, frigid, unyielding principles, that placed his reputation far above his own family. "We do not negotiate with vermin," his father had declared. "It is a sign of weakness." 48 hours after that, their bodies were found. Isabella had been killed instantly, which was a small act of mercy. But Sofia, his dear Sofia, had died while trying to shield her mother from the attack. The medical examiner reported that she had resisted, that she had tried to defend the woman who had brought her into the world. When Dominic went to identify the body, he saw something that completely obliterated what was left of his soul. Sophia's fingers were still tightly clasped around a delicate silver necklace, the exact one Dominic had given her for her 16th birthday only 3 weeks earlier. The pendant on the chain was a small, detailed angel wing. "Because you are my angel," he had said to her when he gave it to her. Now his angel was gone forever. The events that followed became the stuff of legend in Chicago's criminal underworld. Over the next 6 months, Dominic methodically annihilated the entire Castellano family. Every last member, every business associate, every single person who had known about the kidnapping and had chosen to do nothing. He offered no mercy, because no mercy had been given to the people he loved. When the last of the blood was finally cleaned up, Dominic Caruso was the only one left standing at the summit, the youngest and most ruthless boss in the organization's long history. He was also the most broken. That night, as he stood over his sister's fresh grave, Dominic took a solemn vow. He would never love anyone ever again. He would never permit himself to feel for another person. Sentiment was the very weakness that had led to the deaths of his mother and sister, and he swore that such a weakness would never compromise him again. For 10 long years, Dominic honored that dark promise. He constructed walls around his heart that were so high and so impenetrable that nothing could ever get through. He fully became the Reaper, a man devoid of mercy, devoid of sympathy, and devoid of a heart. Until this very night, until a 6-year-old girl with familiar brown eyes gazed up at him with the same complete trust that Sofia once had. The powerful memory vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, but its immense weight settled on Dominic's chest like a tombstone. He blinked, and in an instant, he was back in the velvet crown. The little girl was still desperately clinging to his jacket sleeve, her small frame racked with tremors. Her eyes, those painfully familiar brown eyes, were begging him to do something, to do anything at all. The entire room was still motionless. Not a single person dared to shift their weight. Not a single person dared to draw a breath. And then Dominic Caruso did something that sent a wave of shock through every single man in that restaurant. He rose to his feet. The legs of his chair screeched against the polished marble floor, and the harsh sound sliced through the oppressive silence like a knife. His lieutenants shared bewildered looks. In all the years they had served him, they had never once witnessed their boss react to any situation with such profound urgency. Dominic then lowered himself onto one knee, which brought his face down to the same level as the child's. This close, he could clearly see the tear tracks that cut through the layer of grime on her cheeks. He saw the way her small lower lip trembled as she fought to remain brave. She could not have been more than 6 years old. And still, here she was, standing in a den of killers, completely refusing to surrender. "What is your name?" His voice was gentler than anyone had ever known it to be. "Lily," she managed to whisper. Lily. He repeated the name slowly, committing it to memory as if it were a sacred word. Tell me where your sister is. Through a series of choked sobs and sharp breaths, the little girl recited an address, a dilapidated apartment complex in the South Side, one of the most dangerous sectors in all of Chicago. Dominic recognized the location instantly. It was contested ground for the Black Cobas, a violent gang that had been a thorn in his side for many months. He shot a look at Marco, his most loyal second-in-command, who was standing there completely stunned. Get the vehicles prepared, every single one of them. Go now. Marco paused for a single, fatal heartbeat, just long enough for Dominic to give him a glare so cold it could extinguish the fires of hell. The older man gave a sharp nod and immediately took out his phone, shouting commands as he moved quickly towards the exit. Dominic's attention returned to Lily. The little girl was now trembling with such intensity that her teeth were clicking together, a sound born of either the biting cold, pure terror, or a mixture of both. He could not be sure. Acting on pure instinct, he removed his jacket, a custom-tailored piece worth $10,000 that he had never allowed another person to even touch, and gently placed it around her tiny shoulders. The coat enveloped her, hanging down past her knees like a... No words came from her. Instead, she clung to him with a desperate strength, as if his hand was the last solid thing in a world trying to pull her under. Dominic glanced down. He saw her small hand gripping his, a gesture so fragile yet filled with absolute trust. A feeling stirred inside him, an echo of something he thought was buried forever, something he had not experienced since the night Sophia was taken from him. He felt the weight of responsibility for another soul, a person besides himself. To truly grasp why this single moment would alter the course of their lives, you must first understand the story of Olivia Bennett. You need to hear about the 27 years of pure hell she endured just to stay alive. Her life began in the deepest shadows of Chicago back in 1997. That year opened with a furious blizzard that smothered the city under 3 feet of snow. And in the middle of it all, inside a suffocating apartment on the west side, a little girl took her first breath. There was no celebration for her arrival. Her parents, Richard and Diane Bennett, were far too consumed with finding their next fix. They were slaves to their addiction long before Olivia was conceived. Heroin, cocaine, anything they could find to escape reality. Her very existence was just an unwelcome accident. This child was nothing more than an inconvenience. From the moment she drew air into her lungs, Olivia was a creature unwanted by the world. For 8 long years, she managed to survive within the 4 walls of that apartment. By the time she was 4, she had already taught herself how to find food, rummaging through dusty cabinets for stale crackers or cans of soup long past their expiration date. She learned the art of silence for when her parents were lost in their haze. She learned to vanish into the closet whenever strangers appeared at the door. She became a master of pretending she did not exist at all. There were nights when the gnawing hunger was all she had. There were nights when the bitter cold seeped into her bones. But Olivia, like any child forced into a corner, adapted. She had to, because survival was her only choice. Then, the day finally arrived when her parents concluded she was more trouble than she was worth. She was only 8 years old. They drove her to a grimy bus station in the heart of the city. They gave her a small backpack containing 2 sets of clothes and gave her a simple instruction: wait. We will be right back, her mother murmured, her gaze fixed on the dirty floor. Just stay right here. For 6 agonizing hours, Olivia waited. She waited until a police officer finally noticed the small, abandoned girl. Her parents never returned. They were never seen again. And just like that, the foster care system consumed her entirely. For the following 8 years of her life, Olivia was passed around like an unwanted object. She moved through 7 different houses with 7 different families. Each one was supposed to offer her care, to keep her safe, to give her a glimpse of a normal existence. Not a single one of them did. The first 3 homes saw her as nothing more than a check in the mail. She was a monthly payment from the state, a transaction that provided a cot to sleep on and the bare minimum of food. She was always a burden, another mouth to feed, a problem they preferred to ignore. Nobody ever asked how her day at school went. No one offered to help with her homework. Absolutely no one cared if she lived or died. The fourth family was different. They were so much worse. To this day, Olivia refuses to speak about what took place inside that house. She pushed those memories down, burying them so deep inside herself that she could almost pretend they never happened. Almost. But the scars were still there. They were invisible wounds that cut far deeper than any physical mark ever could. She perfected the skill of making herself small, of becoming invisible to those around her. She learned to never, ever draw attention to herself. Attention always led to pain. When she turned 15, Olivia decided she had endured enough. She ran. She vanished into the sprawling, unforgiving streets of Chicago, carrying nothing except the clothes she was wearing. For 3 long months, she managed to survive completely on her own. She slept in crowded shelters whenever a cot was free and under cold, damp bridges when there was no room. She learned to steal food from convenience stores just to quiet the ache in her stomach. She quickly memorized the city's map of survival, learning which neighborhoods offered safety and which ones could get a person killed. Inevitably, the police found her. Her next stop was a juvenile detention center. She spent the following year inside its cold walls, learning the only lesson the world seemed determined to teach her: trust no one, depend on no one, and expect absolutely nothing from anyone. By the time she officially aged out of the system on her 18th birthday, Olivia Bennet had constructed fortresses around her heart, walls so high and thick they could have rivaled those built by Dominic Caruso himself. She found herself utterly alone in the world. She had no family, no money, and no clear path forward. She was convinced her life would be an endless, repeating cycle of darkness, a tunnel with no glimmer of light at the end. That is, until a single phone call arrived and changed the course of her entire existence. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. At 16, Olivia was still locked away in that juvenile detention center, marking off the days on a calendar until she could legally escape a system that had betrayed her at every possible opportunity. When the counselor announced that her mother was on the phone, a bitter laugh almost escaped her lips. "My mother left me 8 years ago," she stated, her voice completely flat. "I do not have a mother." But a flicker of curiosity took hold, and as always, it won the battle. Over the phone, Diane Bennett's voice sounded strange. It was clearer than Olivia remembered, with none of the usual slur. She insisted she was clean now. She said she had found a job and had completely turned her life around. She desperately wanted to see Olivia. She pleaded for a chance to apologize. She begged for a second chance to be a mother. Olivia did not believe one syllable of it. Still, she agreed to go. Perhaps it was a sliver of hope, that tiny, resilient flame deep inside her that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard life tried to snuff it out. Or maybe, just maybe, she needed the satisfaction of looking her mother directly in the eye and finally telling her exactly what she thought of the woman who had discarded her like a piece of trash. The apartment was a tiny studio on the south side. It was clean, but the air was thick with the scent of cheap air freshener and instant coffee. Diane looked much older than Olivia remembered, and thinner. She had dark circles under her eyes that no amount of makeup could conceal. A nervous smile flickered across Diane's face as she opened the door. For a fleeting second, Olivia felt a pang of something that resembled pity for the woman. But then she heard it. A distinct sound. It was the cry of a baby, coming from a crib tucked away in the corner of the small room. A sudden chill washed over Olivia, and her blood felt like ice in her veins. "What is that?" Olivia asked, her voice sharp. Diane's weak smile completely vanished. That is your sister Lily," she stammered. "She is almost 1 year old." Sister. The word struck Olivia with the force of a physical blow to her chest. It was brutally clear. Her mother had replaced her. She had created another child, started a whole new family, and simply moved on with her life as if Olivia had never even existed. Every instinct screamed at her to leave. She should have walked right out that door, turned her back, and never looked back for a single second. But just then the baby's crying stopped. Against her own will, Olivia felt herself moving toward the crib, pulled by an invisible force she could not comprehend. When she peered over the edge, a pair of large brown eyes stared up at her. They were wide, innocent, and filled with an unwavering trust. Little Lily reached up with her tiny fingers, making a happy gurgling sound, almost as if she saw something familiar in Olivia's face. In that single, powerful moment, something deep inside Olivia's guarded heart began to shift. A crack appeared in the fortress she had built around herself. From that day on, she visited every single week. She kept telling herself it was only to make sure the baby, Lily, was safe and sound. It was obvious her mother was still using drugs. Olivia recognized all the familiar signs, the ones she had memorized as a young child: the slight tremor in her hands, the unnaturally wide pupils, and the cascade of lies that flowed so effortlessly from her lips. The inevitable overdose occurred 6 months later. Olivia was only 17 years old, standing in a sterile hospital corridor. She listened numbly as a social worker explained that Lily would now be placed into the foster care system. It was the very same system that had systematically dismantled Olivia's own childhood. It was the exact same nightmare from which she had only barely managed to escape. Her mind raced, flashing back to the dark closets where she used to hide. She remembered the gnawing hunger from missed meals and the horrors of the fourth family. She recalled all the terrible things she could never, ever bring herself to speak about out loud. "No," Olivia said, her voice quiet but firm. The social worker blinked in surprise. "Excuse me?" "I will take her," Olivia repeated, her voice stronger now. "I will take my sister." That very night, Olivia held Lily in her arms, not just as a visitor, but as her legal guardian. The small baby was fast asleep, her tiny fist curled securely around Olivia's index finger. In the profound silence of that room, Olivia made a solemn vow to the sleeping child. "I will give you the life that I never had," she whispered. "I will do it no matter what it takes." For the next 10 years, Olivia honored that promise, and the cost was immense. A decade of fulfilling that vow had pushed Olivia Bennet to the absolute edge of breaking. Now, at 27, she appeared much older than her years. Permanent dark circles were etched beneath her eyes. Her hands were calloused and cracked from endless manual labor. A persistent, dull ache lived in her back, a constant reminder of her exhaustion that never truly disappeared. But each and every morning, it did not matter how deep her exhaustion ran. Olivia forced herself out of bed and prepared to do it all over again. She did it because Lily depended on her. They lived in a small studio apartment on the south side. It was 400 square feet of crumbling walls and shattered dreams. The heater had been broken for 2 years, forcing them to huddle together under a pile of 3 blankets just to stay warm through the winter. Cockroaches skittered through the cracks in the walls, cracks Olivia had tried her best to seal with duct tape and old newspaper. Every time it rained, the ceiling leaked, leaving ugly brown stains that grew across the plaster like a spreading disease. Across the plaster. This grim little space was all they could possibly afford. To keep even this dilapidated roof over their heads, Olivia worked 3 separate jobs. Her day began every single morning at 4:30, when the shriek of her alarm clock ripped her from sleep. By 5 in the morning, she was already standing behind the counter at Morning Brew. It was a coffee shop downtown, catering to businessmen in expensive suits who never once made eye contact with her. For 6 grueling hours, she forced a smile while dealing with entitled customers and enduring scalding coffee burns on her hands. The tips she pocketed for her efforts rarely amounted to more than $20 for the entire shift. Promptly at noon, she would clock in for her second job at Petal and Vine, a little flower shop on Madison Street. The owner, a woman named Mrs. Chen, was kind, and she would sometimes let Olivia take home any damaged flowers for Lily. For another 6 hours, she would carefully arrange beautiful bouquets. They were for extravagant weddings she could never afford, for the funerals of complete strangers, and for Valentine's Day lovers who experienced a life she could only imagine in her wildest dreams. At 8 o'clock in the evening, when most people were home relaxing with their families, Olivia's third job began. She would strap on a pair of rubber gloves and clean massive office buildings until the stroke of midnight. She scrubbed toilets and vacuumed endless stretches of carpet, and she emptied heavy trash cans, often filled with the half-eaten remnants of expensive meals that cost more than she earned in an entire day. After all that, she would get 4 hours of sleep. Then, she would wake up and repeat the entire cycle. Her body was quite literally falling apart under the strain. In the winter, her hands would bleed, the skin cracking open from the cold, no matter how much lotion she desperately applied. Her lower back would seize up without any warning, the sharp pain sometimes making her gasp between serving customers. Over the past year, she had lost 15 pounds, a significant amount of weight that her already thin frame could not afford to lose. But none of her own suffering mattered. It was nothing compared to Lily's diagnosis. The words from the doctor echoed in her mind. Congenital heart defect. The doctors had found the condition when Lily was just 3 years old. They explained that without a complex surgery, her small heart would eventually give out. The cost for this life-saving procedure was $80,000. It was an astronomical, impossible amount of money for someone who struggled just to pay for rent and groceries each month. For 3 relentless years, Olivia had been saving every penny. She cut every possible corner, she skipped meals, she wore her clothes until they were threadbare. After all that sacrifice, she had managed to gather $12,000. It was nowhere near enough. And on top of everything, there was the other, more dangerous debt she owed. A debt to the Black Cobras, ruled the South Side with an unforgiving grip. For them, mercy was a weakness. Every shop owner, every family, had to pay for peace. The price was $200 a month, a small fortune to keep your windows from being shattered and your life from getting worse. Olivia was behind. Lily's last stay in the hospital had drained everything, and now she owed $2,400 to men who treated excuses like insults. So she kept her head low, invisible, and silent. She worked until her bones ached, clinging to a desperate hope that things had to get better. But a different kind of darkness stalked Olivia, one far more personal than any street gang. His name was Tyler Ashford. He entered her life on a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 years before. He came into the morning brew moments before she locked up, drenched and shivering from the storm. The late-hour customers were usually bitter and rushed, tossing money on the counter. Tyler was not like them. He looked at her and smiled, a genuine smile that saw her, not the apron she wore. He even asked for her name. On a $4 coffee, he left a $20 tip. He returned the following morning and the morning after that. For a woman who had spent a lifetime feeling like a ghost, being seen by Tyler felt like the first ray of sun after a decade of winter. He knew she took her coffee with cream. He asked about Lily by name. He leaned in closer when she spoke of her quiet dream, a little flower shop of her own one day. Olivia knew better than to trust kindness. A difficult 27 years had carved that rule into her heart. But Tyler's patience was a slow, steady current. He never demanded her time. He never pushed for more than she offered. He just appeared, day after day, with his warm smile and easy conversation. After 3 long months of this, she finally said yes to a dinner invitation. Their first 6 months together felt like a borrowed fairy tale. Tyler was caring, generous, and fiercely protective. He brought toys for Lily and spent Sundays pushing them both on the swings at the park. He held Olivia as she wept over the surgery bills she could never pay. For the first time, she did not feel utterly alone in the world. But then, the beautiful mask started to fracture. The changes began subtly. Tyler needed to know her location at every moment of the day. He would scroll through her phone messages while she was in the shower. He grew quiet and cold whenever she was friendly with male customers at the cafe. He would ask why she insisted on working 3 jobs when he could easily provide for her. Olivia knew these warning signs. She had seen them in the eyes of foster parents and in the shadows of the youth detention center. They were the flags of every trap from her childhood. She dismissed her own fears, telling herself she was misjudging him. Tyler was just protective because he loved her. The first time his hand struck her, it was exactly 1 year after their first meeting. She had returned late from her cleaning service, too physically drained to answer his repeated calls. He was already inside her apartment, having made a copy of her key without her permission. Their conversation quickly turned into an argument. His hand cracked across her face before her mind could even register the movement. Afterward, his tears came. Tears. He begged for forgiveness. He promised with all his heart it would never happen again. His promise was a lie. It happened again, and again, and again. When Olivia finally found the strength to tell him it was over, Tyler simply refused to hear it. He began appearing at all of her jobs. He would follow her on the walk home. He would stand outside her building in the dead of night, his empty eyes fixed on her window, carrying a silent promise of violence. Then, he became a member of the Black Cobras. Olivia learned this truth when Tyler trapped her in the narrow alley behind Petal and Vine. He told her he worked for Viper now, that he had real power and influential connections. He warned her that if she ever considered calling the police, or even thought about running away, he would ensure Lily vanished deep into the foster system, never to be seen again. "You are mine," he breathed against her skin. "You always will be." From that day on, Olivia would scan the dark street below her apartment before daring to turn off the lights. And without fail, Tyler was always there, a statue of menace watching and waiting from across the road. He never moved, never acted. He simply stood there. That quiet, constant threat was somehow the most terrifying part of it all. The official letter came on a Monday. Olivia had just dragged herself home from her shift at Morning Brew. Her feet were screaming, and a dull ache throbbed in her head from sheer exhaustion. She sorted through the mail on her way up the stairs. It was all bills and junk mail, but there was one crisp envelope bearing the hospital's logo in the corner. Her fingers shook as she tore it open. "Dear Miss Bennett," the letter began, "this is to inform you that the surgical procedure for Lily Bennett requires a deposit payment of $15,000. This payment is due within 30 days. Failure to provide the required deposit will lead to the cancellation of the procedure and her removal from the surgical waiting list." The words swam before her as hot tears flooded her vision. $15,000. In just 30 days. She had managed to save $12,000 over 3 grueling years of constant sacrifice. How in the world could she possibly find another $3,000 in a single month? She was already working every single hour they would give her. There was nothing left to cut, nothing more to sacrifice. Olivia barely made it into the bathroom before the sobs tore through her. She collapsed onto the cold tile floor, shoving a fist into her mouth to silence her cries. Lily was in the living room, watching her cartoons. She could not let her little sister see her like this. Lily, at only 6 years old, already carried far too much worry about doctors and hospitals, needles, and the strange way her own heart sometimes ached. She did not need the added burden of knowing her big sister was completely falling apart. Later that evening, Olivia arrived home from her cleaning job just after midnight. A deep ache settled into every muscle. She had expected to find Lily sound asleep, but the little girl was wide awake in her bed, clutching a folded piece of paper. "I drew this for you," Lily said softly, offering up her crayon creation. Olivia accepted it with unsteady hands. The drawing showed 2 stick figures, one tall and one very small, holding hands directly under a vibrant, colorful rainbow. At the top of the page, in shaky letters, were the words, Liv and Lily. Do you love it? Lily asked, her large brown eyes studying her sister's expression. You looked so sad today. Are you still sad, Liv? Olivia managed to form a smile, even as she felt her spirit cracking under the strain. No, baby girl. I'm just very tired. Lily immediately scrambled into her lap, wrapping her small, warm arms around her neck. When you stop being tired, can you smile for real? I really like it when you smile, Liv. That evening, Olivia held her little sister tightly, long after the girl had drifted off to sleep. She lay in the dark, staring up at the familiar water stains on the ceiling, listening to the soft, even rhythm of Lily's breathing. And then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She began to pray. She prayed for some kind of miracle. She prayed for a way out of this impossible corner, for anything at all to change their fate. She had no way of knowing that the next day would be the absolute worst day of her entire life, but it would also be the day that set a new course for everything. Her miracle was coming. But to get there, Olivia would be forced to endure hell one last time. The following evening began just like any other. At 9:30 at night, Olivia was on her hands and knees inside a quiet law office in the city center, scrubbing a dark coffee stain out of a plush, expensive rug. Her back was screaming a fiery protest. Her eyes stung with exhaustion, yet she continued to scrub. Giving up was not a choice she had. Lily was safe in their apartment. Mrs. Patterson, the kind elderly woman next door, had promised to listen for any trouble through the paper-thin walls between them. It was far from a perfect arrangement, but it was the only one Olivia could manage. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She let it go at first, assuming it was another telemarketer, but it buzzed a second time, then a third. Annoyed, she finally pulled it out and saw Mrs. Patterson's name illuminating the screen. Olivia! The old woman's voice was frail and filled with panic. There is someone inside your apartment. I heard yelling. I heard Lily start to scream. The cleaning mop fell from her hand with a loud clatter. Olivia simply ran. She didn't bother with the slow elevator. She flew down the emergency stairwell, shoving the door open and breaking into a desperate sprint across 6 blocks of shadowy Chicago streets. Her lungs felt like they were on fire and her legs burned with every step, but the only sound in her head was Mrs. Patterson's terrified voice. I heard Lily scream. The door to her apartment was already hanging open when she finally got there. Tyler was standing right in the middle of her small living room. The air was thick with the stench of whiskey and pure rage. His eyes were shot with red, his face contorted into a monstrous mask. Lily was huddled in the far corner, her tiny frame pressed hard against the wall as tears streamed down her pale face. Well, look who it is, Tyler slurred, his head turning slowly toward Olivia. A terrible smile spread across his face, a sight that turned her blood to ice. My girl is finally back home where she belongs. Get out, Olivia said. Her voice trembled, but she planted her feet and forced herself to stand her ground. Get out of my home right now, Tyler. He let out a harsh, grating laugh. I saw you earlier, at the flower market, talking to that other guy, laughing with him. His hands tightened into massive fists at his sides. Do you actually think you can replace me? Do you think anyone else on this earth would ever really want you? We are over, Tyler. We have been over for months. You have to leave now. She took a cautious step toward Lily, trying to position her own body between her sister and the monster, but Tyler moved with shocking speed. He seized her arm, wrenching her back with so much force it tore a cry of pain from her lips. You don't get to tell me when we're finished, he snarled, his face inches from hers. I am the one who decides. Only me. The first blow came without warning, catching her high on the cheekbone. Olivia's head snapped to the side as a starburst of pain exploded behind her eyes. She staggered from the impact but refused to fall. She could not fall, not while Lily was watching, not while Lily was crying. Her little sister needed her to be strong. The second punch landed in her stomach, stealing all the air from her lungs and forcing her to double over. Tyler grabbed a fistful of her hair, violently yanking her head back. "If I am not allowed to have you," he hissed directly into her ear, "then nobody will." He shoved her hard, sending her crashing to the floor. His heavy work boot connected with her ribs once, then twice, then a third time. The coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. The entire room began to spin. Through a dizzying fog of agony, she could hear Lily's terrified screams. She could feel two small hands trying to pull on her arm. "Liv! Liv, please stop hurting her, stop!" No, this could not be happening. Lily should not be here. She should not have to see this. Olivia pried her eyes open, struggling to focus on her sister's horrified face. Tyler was now fumbling with the buckle on his belt, his eyes completely vacant of any human emotion. "Lily," her voice was a shattered whisper. "Run! I'm not leaving you! Run!" Olivia screamed, using the very last of her strength. "Go get help! Go right now!" Lily froze, her entire body shaking as tears poured down her cheeks. Olivia met her sister's gaze, truly seeing her, and spoke the only words in the world that mattered. "I love you, Lily. Now run." Lily bolted out the door, never once looking back. The sickening sounds of fists hitting flesh echoed behind her. She flew down the flights of stairs, her small bare feet smacking against the freezing concrete. She had no idea where she was going, and had no plan at all. The only thought in her mind was that Liv was hurt. Liv was bleeding badly, and she had to find someone, anyone, who could help. The night air crashed into her like a sheet of ice. Chicago in the late fall showed no mercy, with temperatures that danced near freezing. Lily was wearing only her thin cotton nightgown, her favorite pink one with the little white flowers. She had no shoes on her feet and no coat to protect her. Within moments, the frozen pavement stole all feeling from her feet. But she did not stop running. The south side was a completely different place after dark. The streetlights either flickered weakly or were broken entirely. Dark shapes moved in the mouths of alleys. A distant siren wailed through the night. Lily sprinted past homeless men huddled for warmth in doorways, and past groups of teenagers who yelled things at her that she could not understand. She ran past the dark storefronts, their windows protected by heavy iron bars. Find help. Find someone strong. Find someone who can save Liv. Her 6-year-old brain desperately sorted through her options. Mrs. Patterson from downstairs was too old to help. The police station felt like it was 100 miles away. She did not know anyone else in the city. More importantly, she did not trust anyone else. Liv had always drilled it into her head never to talk to strangers and never to trust anyone in this dangerous neighborhood. And then a memory surfaced. About 3 weeks ago, she and Liv had been walking past a very fancy restaurant downtown. Lily had stopped to gaze at the brilliant lights, the sleek, expensive cars lining the street, and the men in sharp suits who looked like they belonged in movies. Liv had seized her hand and pulled her away with a sudden urgency. "You never go near that place," Liv had warned, her voice strained with fear. "The most dangerous people in the entire city eat there. Promise me, Lily. Promise me you will always stay away." The most dangerous people. Lily's frozen feet continued to carry her forward. A fire burned in her lungs. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, so loud she could hear it. But a strange logic clicked into place inside her young mind. A reasoning that only a truly desperate child could find. Dangerous meant strong, and strong meant powerful. And powerful meant someone who could stop the bad man who was hurting her sister. She had to find the most dangerous person in all of Chicago. She ran 8 full blocks. 8 blocks through one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. A tiny little girl in a blood-spattered nightgown, leaving small, bloody footprints on the icy sidewalk behind her. By the time she finally arrived at the Velvet Crown, her legs were about to collapse. A huge man dressed in a black suit guarded the entrance. He glared down at her, first with confusion and then with pure disgust. "Get lost, kid," he grumbled. "We don't allow beggars here." Lily tried to dart around him. He moved to block her with ease. Please, she choked out. My sister. He repeated himself. Get lost. So Lily did the only thing that came to her mind. She bit him. Her small teeth sank into the flesh of his hand with every ounce of strength she could summon. The massive guard roared in shock and pain, yanking his arm away. In that single moment of opportunity, Lily dove under his legs and burst through the heavy doors. She found herself in a room filled with monsters, and in the presence of the single most dangerous man in Chicago. 8 blocks, bare feet, in temperatures below freezing, a 6-year-old girl, all alone in the darkness, running straight toward the one place she had been warned to avoid at all costs. It was the most profound act of courage Dominic Caruso had ever seen. 5 black sport utility vehicles tore through the streets of Chicago like a pack of wolves on the hunt. Red lights were meaningless. Speed limits were completely ignored. Dominic's drivers knew every back road, every hidden alley, and every possible shortcut to cut precious seconds from their journey. A drive that should have taken 20 minutes was over in just 7. Dominic held Lily securely on his lap for the entire ride. Her small body was pressed tightly against his chest. Her tears had stopped, but she could not stop trembling. Every few seconds she would whisper the same words over and over. Please hurry, please hurry, please hurry. The apartment building looked exactly as he had imagined. It was a crumbling ruin, a monument to poverty and total neglect. The walls were covered in graffiti. At least half of the windows were boarded up with plywood. The heavy smell of garbage and human despair filled the air. This was the place they called home. This was the reality Olivia returned to after working herself to the bone every single night. Dominic carried Lily up 3 long flights of stairs, his men forming a protective circle around him. The door to apartment 3B was hanging wide open, dangling from a single hinge. They had arrived too late to catch him. Tyler Ashford was gone. Dominic could just make out the fading sound of footsteps racing down the stairwell at the opposite end of the hall. The coward must have heard the cars approaching and fled like the rat he was. But Dominic barely noticed Tyler's escape, because the instant he crossed the threshold into that apartment, the rest of the world simply faded away. Olivia was on the floor, completely motionless. A pool of blood was spreading out from beneath her head, a shocking splash of red against the dirty linoleum. Her face was almost unrecognizable. One of her eyes was swollen completely shut. Her lips were split and bleeding. Dark purple bruises were already beginning to form across her high cheekbones. Her arm was bent at an angle so unnatural it made Dominic's stomach clench. She was not moving at all. For one agonizing, terrible heartbeat, he was certain she was dead. Then, he saw her chest rise. It was a shallow, barely perceptible movement, but it was enough. Dominic had been surrounded by violence for his entire life. He had ordered it, he had committed it, and he had built a powerful empire upon it. He had believed he was immune to its horrors, that he was hardened to the point that nothing could ever shock him again. He was wrong. This was different. This was not business. This was not some rival gangster who understood the risks of the game. This was an innocent woman who had done nothing wrong except simply exist. A woman who worked 3 jobs just to care for her sick little sister. A woman whose only crime was that she tried to get away from a monster. And the tiny apartment around her told its own tragic story. The cracked plaster walls, the broken heater in the corner, the cockroaches that scurried away into the shadows. This was their life. This was the battle Olivia fought every single day. Something ancient and truly terrible awakened deep inside of him, a rage so pure it felt like ice burned in Dominic's chest. Lily scrambled out of his arms and rushed to her sister's side, collapsing onto her broken body. Liv, wake up. I brought help. Please, please wake up. Olivia's one good eye fluttered open. Her gaze found Lily, and only Lily, as her cracked lips tried to form words. Are you okay? Did he hurt you? Beaten nearly to death, and her very first thought was still for her sister. Dominic knelt down next to them, his voice remarkably steady despite the hurricane of fury raging within him. "She is safe," he said. "You are both safe now." He turned to Marco, who was standing frozen in the doorway, his face pale. "Call an ambulance. St. Mary's Hospital. Tell them I am on my way personally." Then Dominic did something he had not done since Sophia died. He carefully gathered the broken woman into his own arms and carried her himself. As he lifted Olivia from that blood-stained floor, he looked down at her shattered face and made a silent, deadly vow. The man who did this would pay for it with every single thing he had. St. Mary's Hospital was the most prestigious private medical facility in all of Chicago. It also happened to be owned, in its entirety, by Dominic Caruso. The convoy of black sport utility vehicles screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance at 10:47 p.m. A team of doctors and nurses was already assembled and waiting. Marco had called ahead. And when Dominic Caruso made a call, people moved without question. Within seconds, Olivia was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and whisked away through the automatic doors, surrounded by a swarm of medical professionals. Dominic followed them inside, still carrying Lily in his arms. He paused at the main reception desk, where a visibly nervous administrator was fumbling with a stack of paperwork. "Mr. Caruso, sir, we are going to need some insurance information and—" Dominic cut him off sharply. "You will get your best surgeons, your best equipment, your very best of everything." His eyes were like chips of ice. "And if anyone has questions about payment, you will send them directly to me. Is that understood?" The administrator nodded his head frantically and then scurried away. The next 3 hours became the longest and most difficult of Dominic's entire life. He sat in the private waiting room just outside the surgical wing. He was surrounded by expensive leather chairs and artwork that now looked disgusting. Lily was on a small couch next to him. A kind nurse had bandaged her feet, which were now tucked safely beneath her. She held a hospital pillow tightly against her chest. Her eyes were locked on the large double doors where her sister had disappeared. She had not said a word since they got here. Dominic watched her from the side. She looked so small, so incredibly fragile. But tonight, she did something that grown men twice her size would be too afraid to do. She had run through a nightmare to save someone she loved. "Your sister is going to be okay," he said, his voice low. Lily did not turn to look at him. "How can you be sure?" she asked. "Because the very best doctors in this city are taking care of her at this moment." The room was quiet again. Then, in a tiny voice that almost broke his heart, she asked, "Do you promise?" Dominic started to speak, ready to give a vague answer, an empty comfort without any real commitment. He knew that promises were dangerous things. Promises could always be broken. He had learned that painful lesson 10 years ago, standing over 2 fresh graves. But then those big brown eyes looked at him, and they were filled with a desperate hope he knew all too well. "I promise," he heard his own voice say. It was the first promise he had made to another person in a decade. He saw something change in Lily's tiny body. All the tension she had carried since she ran into the velvet crown finally let go. Without saying anything else, she leaned over, and her head rested gently against Dominic's arm. In just a few minutes, she was fast asleep. Dominic stayed perfectly still. He barely even breathed. This little girl, who had every reason in the world to be terrified of men like him, had decided to trust him without question. The weight of her head on his arm felt heavier than any responsibility he had ever known. On the other side of the room, Marco just stood there, completely stunned. In 15 years of working for him, he had never once seen Dominic Caruso show kindness to anyone. The Reaper did not give comfort. The Reaper did not make promises. And he certainly did not let children fall asleep on his arm. But this night, everything had changed. At 2 in the morning, the surgeon finally came out. Olivia was in stable condition. She had many bruises, 2 cracked ribs, a broken wrist, and serious injuries to her face. But she was going to live. She would need a lot of rest and time to get better. Dominic gave a slow nod, being careful not to wake the child who was still sleeping on him. He knew, however, that the night was far from finished. There was more work that had to be done. There were people who had to answer for what they did. While Lily slept and Olivia started to recover, Dominic began to work. He took over an empty office on the hospital's administrative floor, quickly turning it into his temporary headquarters. His men moved in and out with quiet purpose, finding information, making phone calls, and pulling together all the pieces to see the whole story of what happened that night. By 4 in the morning, Marco had all the details. Tyler Ashford, Marco said, sliding a folder across the large desk. He is 29 years old, has no real job, and no valuable skills. But about 6 months ago, he started to work for the Black Cobras. Dominic opened the folder. Tyler's photograph stared up at him. It was a handsome face, but it was hiding something truly rotten deep inside. It was the type of face that could trick a woman into trusting him completely. He takes his orders directly from Marcus Reeves, Marco went on. On the street, they call him Viper. He is in charge of the Southside operations for the Cobras. They are a small outfit compared to us, but they are getting bigger. They have been getting into protection rackets and loan sharking, all the usual stuff. And Olivia? Marco paused for a moment. That is the part that gets really ugly, boss. He took out another piece of paper. It showed financial records, reports from surveillance, and a timeline that told a terrible story. Viper knew about the little girl's heart problem. He knew about the surgery, and he knew exactly how much it was going to cost. He knew Olivia was completely desperate for the money. Marco's jaw became tight with anger. He had Tyler get close to her as part of the plan. The entire relationship, and even the abuse, it was all set up. Dominic's hand stopped moving on the folder. Explain it to me. Viper was planning to offer Olivia a loan. It would be enough for the surgery, but the interest rates were so high she could never possibly pay it back. When she could not pay, which was guaranteed, he would own her. He would force her to work to pay off the debt. Marco stopped talking. There are only a few ways a young woman can pay back that kind of money to men like Viper. The silence that filled the room was thick and heavy. Dominic finally understood everything. Tyler was not just some angry ex-boyfriend who got violent. He was a weapon, a method to make Olivia feel alone, to control her, and to break her spirit until she felt like she had nowhere else to go but into Viper's carefully laid trap. The protection money she supposedly owed, the constant threats, the stalking, every single part of it was planned to push her toward that one terrible outcome. The $2,400 she owes for protection, Dominic said, his voice dangerously quiet. That money goes directly to Viper, every last cent. He has been draining that whole neighborhood for a long time. Olivia was just a target of special interest. Dominic shut the folder and looked at the wall. His face showed no emotion, but deep inside him, something cold and very old was beginning to wake up. It was the exact same feeling he had 10 years before, when he discovered who had taken his mother and his sister from him. Boss, Marco said, shifting his weight. He was clearly uncomfortable. What are your orders? Call Viper. Dominic's voice was completely calm. It was too calm. Tell him I want to meet with him tonight. At 2 in the morning. At the old warehouse on Industrial Avenue. Marco nodded his head, but then he hesitated. What about Tyler? Our people are already searching for him. He could not have gone very far. Dominic stood up and buttoned his suit jacket with slow, deliberate movements. Tyler can wait a little longer. I have something very special planned just for him. He walked over to the window and looked out at the Chicago skyline as the first light of dawn started to appear. For 10 long years, Dominic Caruso had made every decision based on cold business logic. Every single choice was calculated. Every action was measured by how much profit and power it would bring. There was no room for emotion in his life, but tonight was not about territory. It was not about money or showing strength or making his empire larger. Tonight was deeply personal. The morning sun was pouring through silk curtains when Olivia finally opened her eyes. For a moment, she was convinced this was all a dream. The ceiling hanging over her was a perfect clean white, a stark contrast to the cracked and water-stained one in her small apartment. The sheets felt impossibly soft against her skin, and the air carried the scent of fresh flowers, not the usual smell of garbage and damp mold. Then, the pain crashed over her. Every single part of her body screamed in agony when she tried to shift her weight. Her ribs felt like they were on fire with every single breath. Her left arm was trapped inside a heavy cast. As she brought her right hand up to her face, her fingers found bandages, swollen flesh, and the tight pull of stitches. The memories returned in a violent rush. Tyler, his fists, the beating. She remembered Lily screaming, "Lily!" A sudden, cold panic gripped Olivia's heart. She tried to force herself to sit up, but a fresh wave of agony shot through her torso, making her gasp. Where was Lily? What happened to her little sister? Did Tyler survive? A small voice came from her right side. Olivia turned her head, a slow and painful motion, and saw her sister. She was curled up on a leather sofa, wrapped in a blanket that looked like it cost more than a month of their rent. Lily was safe. Tears started to slide down Olivia's bruised cheeks. "Oh, thank God. Lily, you are okay." Before another word could escape her lips, the door to the room swung open. A man stepped inside. He was tall, with dark hair, and wore a suit that radiated wealth and immense power. His face was a hard, unreadable mask, with eyes the color of steel that seemed to take everything in but give nothing away. A thin, pale scar traced a line down his left cheek. Olivia's survival instincts screamed to life. She struggled to push herself up, to place her broken body between this imposing stranger and her sister, but her body refused to obey. The pain exploded through her ribs, and a cry escaped her cracked lips. "Do not move." The man's voice was quiet, yet it carried an undeniable command. "You will tear your stitches." "Who are you?" Olivia's voice was a dry rasp. "Where am I? What is it that you want from us?" The man stopped at the foot of her bed, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. "My name is Dominic Caruso. You are in St. Mary's Hospital, and your sister is the one who came to find me last night." Olivia's gaze shot over to Lily, who was now awake and watching them with her enormous brown eyes. "I do not understand," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. She ran 8 blocks through the cold to get help. All alone with no shoes on, Dominic's attention shifted to the small child. "She found me." The weight of his words slowly began to settle in her mind. Dominic Caruso. Even in her isolated world, Olivia recognized that name. They called him the Reaper, the most feared and dangerous man in all of Chicago. "I cannot pay," Olivia's voice broke. "I do not have any money. I cannot pay for this room, or the doctors, or any of this. I have absolutely nothing to give you. I am not asking you for payment." Olivia just stared at him, searching for the hidden price. There was always a hidden price. No one ever did something for nothing. "What do you want from me?" Dominic remained silent for a long, heavy moment. Then he looked back at Lily. For a second, something unreadable flickered in those cold eyes. "That little girl just walked through hell to save you. She is 6 years old, and she showed more courage than most men I have ever known." He then turned his gaze back to Olivia. "That is your answer." He left the room without saying anything else. Olivia just lay there, her eyes fixed on the closed door, trying to process what had just occurred. For her entire life, every act of kindness she had ever received came with strings attached. Every helping hand eventually came back to demand its payment. This was the first time someone had helped her without asking for anything in return. And in a strange way, that scared her more than anything else ever had. 2 hours later, her doctor came in with news that would shatter Olivia's world all over again. Dr. Chen was a kind-looking woman who appeared to be in her 50s, with gentle hands and eyes that had clearly seen far too much suffering. She checked Olivia's vital signs, carefully examined her injuries, and then delivered the prognosis with a calm, professional tone. You are healing well, all things considered. The ribs will take about 6 to 8 weeks. Your wrist will take about the same amount of time. The cuts on your face should leave very minimal scarring if you follow the care instructions. She paused for a moment, looking down at her clipboard. But there is something else that we need to discuss. A chill ran through Olivia's veins. Lily, is she all right? Did something happen to her? We ran some tests on her when she was admitted last night. It is the standard procedure for any child that comes through our doors. Dr. Chen's expression softened with a deep sympathy. Miss Bennett, your sister's heart condition has deteriorated significantly since her last checkup. The words struck Olivia like another brutal punch to her broken ribs. What do you mean, deteriorated? The defect is progressing much faster than we anticipated. Without surgical intervention, Dr. Chen hesitated. She will need the operation within 2 weeks, maybe 3 at the most. If we wait any longer than that, the damage could become irreversible. 2 weeks. Olivia had been desperately counting on having months, maybe even a full year, to scrape together the rest of the money she needed. 2 weeks was completely impossible. How much? Her voice was barely a whisper. The surgery, the hospital stay, the aftercare, all the medication. Dr. Chen looked at her notes. It will be approximately $80,000. The number just hung in the air, feeling like a death sentence. Olivia stared blankly at the ceiling as silent tears slid down her temples and disappeared into her hair. $80,000. She had managed to save $12,000. $12,000 that was the result of 3 years of unimaginable sacrifice, of countless skipped meals, of 16-hour days and 4-hour nights. It was not even close to being enough. I have 12,000, she heard her own voice say. I can get more. I will work more hours. I can borrow money. I will do anything. Please, she is all that I have in this world. I will sell everything I own. I will. I do not know. I will find a way. Just please, please do not let her die. Schedule the surgery. The voice came from the doorway. Olivia turned her head and saw Dominic Caruso standing there again. His face was completely without expression, his eyes locked on Lily, who was playing quietly in the corner with some crayons a nurse had brought for her. Dr. Chen stood up a little straighter. Mr. Caruso, schedule the surgery. Get the very best surgeon you have. I do not care what it costs. He finally looked over at Olivia. I will cover the entire cost. No. Olivia struggled to sit up again, completely ignoring the searing pain. No, I cannot let you do that. You cannot. Why? Why are you doing this for us? Dominic walked slowly into the room, stopping right beside Lily's little art station. The small girl looked up at him and smiled, a real, genuine smile, before she went back to her drawing. Why? Olivia asked again, her voice cracking under the strain. I just do not understand. You do not know us. You do not owe us anything at all. Dominic was quiet for a very long moment, watching Lily's little hand move the crayon across the paper. Someone reminded me, he said at last, that true courage can sometimes come from the most unexpected of places. He looked at Olivia, and he truly looked at her, and for just a single moment she saw something flicker behind those steel-gray eyes. Something broken, something human. Rest now, he said. You need to heal. Let me worry about everything else. He turned and walked out of the room without even waiting for her to respond. Olivia lay there, tears flowing freely now, unable to understand what had just happened. $80,000. A total stranger had just promised to pay $80,000 for a child he had only met less than 12 hours ago. Dominic stepped out into the hallway, where Marco was waiting with a phone in his hand. Viper has confirmed the meeting. 2 a.m, the warehouse. Dominic gave a short nod, his expression hardening back into stone. Tonight, there would be a final reckoning, and a man named Viper would learn exactly why everyone called him the Reaper. The abandoned warehouse on Industrial Avenue had seen far better days. Rust was eating away at the corrugated metal walls. Broken windows allowed the bitter Chicago wind to howl through the space. The concrete floor was cracked and deeply stained with decades of oil, grease, and other things that were better left unexamined. It was the type of place where shadowy deals were made, and where people sometimes just disappeared. At 2 in the morning, two separate convoys of cars arrived from opposite ends of the district. Marcus Viper Reeves stepped out of his black Escalade with the confident swagger of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. At 32 years old, he had clawed his way up from being a street dealer to the boss of the Black Cobras, using a mix of pure brutality and sharp cunning. A large snake tattoo coiled around his neck, its fanged head resting just beneath his jaw, a clear warning to anyone who might think of underestimating him. 8 of his best men stood at his side, all of them armed and ready for a fight. Dominic Caruso emerged from his vehicle with Marco and 4 other men. On paper, he was outnumbered and outgunned, but anyone who knew anything about Chicago's criminal underworld knew that numbers meant nothing when you were facing the Reaper. The two bosses met in the middle of the warehouse floor, while their men spread out behind them like two opposing armies. Viper was the first to speak, a grin splitting his face to reveal a gold tooth. Dominic Caruso, in the flesh. He spread his arms wide, as if he were greeting an old friend. I have to say, I am truly honored. The Great Reaper himself, coming all the way down here just for a meeting. And for what? His grin turned cruel and ugly. For some whore and her sick little brat. The silence that followed his words was absolute. Then, in one perfect, synchronized movement, Dominic's 4 men raised their weapons. The sound of the safeties clicking off echoed through the massive warehouse like the tolling of a funeral bell. Dominic did not move a muscle. His hands stayed clasped behind his back. His expression was still carved from stone, but his eyes, those steel-gray eyes, now burned with something ancient and truly terrifying. "Call her that again," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I dare you." Viper's confident grin faltered, just for a second. His men began to shift nervously, their hands hovering near their own guns. The tension in the air was so thick you could almost taste it. "Easy, easy." Viper raised his hands in a mocking gesture of surrender. "There is no need to get all worked up. I am just saying, you are Dominic Caruso. You run half of Chicago. Why do you even care about some nobody from the South Side?" Dominic took a single step forward. It was just one step, but it was enough to make all of Viper's men take an instinctive step back. "Let me tell you what I know," Dominic said, his voice perfectly calm and cold. "I know that you have been bleeding that neighborhood completely dry. Protection, money from people who can barely afford to buy food. I know you go after the desperate ones, the single mothers, the elderly, anyone who is too weak to stand up to you." He moved another step closer. "I know you learned about a little girl with a serious heart condition, and I know you sent one of your pathetic dogs to get close to her sister. Your plan was to control her, to break her down completely until she had no other choice but to come crawling to you for help." Viper's smile was completely gone now. "That is just business, Caruso. You, of all people, should know that. Business." Dominic reached inside his jacket pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. He opened it up very slowly. It was a crayon drawing of 2 little stick figures holding hands underneath a bright rainbow. "Do you want to know what makes you and me different, Viper?" He held the drawing up for him to see. "I have done terrible things in my life. I have hurt people. I have built an empire on fear and on blood." His jaw clenched. "But I have never, not once, targeted women and children. That is a line I will not cross. That is a line that no real man ever crosses." Viper just snorted. "You are getting soft, old man. Getting all emotional over some kid's little drawing." Dominic folded the drawing back up with great care and put it back in his pocket, right over his heart. This picture was drawn by a 6-year-old girl. A girl who ran 8 blocks in the freezing cold, with no shoes, in just her pajamas, to get help for her sister. She walked into a room filled with killers and did not even flinch, his eyes locked with Viper's. That is what real courage is. That is what real strength looks like. And you? You are nothing more than a coward who attacks people who cannot defend themselves. Viper let out a harsh, ugly laugh. Those are big words coming from a man who is outnumbered. What do you actually think you can do in here, Caruso? He motioned toward his 8 men. All of them now had their hands on their weapons. Viper was sure he had all the power. He believed this meeting was just a negotiation between two equals. He had absolutely no idea what Dominic had already set in motion. Dominic let Viper's proud words hang in the silent warehouse for a moment before he answered. "This is what is going to happen now," he said. His voice was filled with complete and total authority. "First, the Black Cobras will leave the South Side entirely. You will leave every corner, every block, and every single building. This goes into effect right now." Viper's eyebrows went up in surprise. "You have to be joking." Second, Dominic kept talking as if Viper had said nothing at all. "You will give back every single dollar of protection money that you have taken from that neighborhood for the last 2 years. Every shop owner, every family, every person you have taken money from will get it all back. That is hundreds of thousands of dollars." Third, Dominic's voice became even lower and harder. "You will deliver Tyler Ashford to me, in person. No matter what hole he has crawled into, you will be the one to find him and bring him to me." Viper's expression had changed from amused to shocked, and now it was starting to look like pure panic. "You are completely out of your mind, Caruso. I am not giving you." Fourth, Dominic took one last step forward. He was so close now that Viper could see the cold rage burning inside those gray eyes. "You will apologize to Olivia Bennett in person, and you will do it on your knees." The warehouse became completely silent. Then, Viper started to laugh. It began as a small chuckle, but it grew into a loud, mocking sound that bounced off the rusted metal walls. "You are insane," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You show up here with only 5 men. You are outnumbered and you are outgunned. And you actually think you are in a position to make demands?" He pointed at his own crew. "I have 8 soldiers here who are ready to put bullets into you this very second. What is really stopping me from ending the Reaper tonight and taking over every single thing you have ever built?" Dominic did not say a word. He simply lifted his right hand into the air and snapped his fingers. The darkness was suddenly shattered by light. Huge industrial floodlights that were mounted high up on the warehouse walls all turned on at once, filling the entire space with a painfully bright white light. And in that brilliant light, Viper finally saw what he had completely missed. 30 men materialized from nothing. They stepped out from behind corroded factory equipment and dropped down from the shadowy catwalks above. They filled every doorway, lining the walls, and every single one of them was armed. The weapons were all aimed squarely at Viper's crew. Before a single member of the Black Cobras could even think about reaching for a weapon, it was already over. Dominic's soldiers moved with a cold, professional speed, disarming Viper's men in a few heartbeats. They forced them onto the cold concrete floor, one by one, hands clasped behind their heads, utterly defeated. Viper was left standing alone in the vast, open center of the warehouse, feeling his world shrink around him. Dominic's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "You were saying something before? I believe it was about me being outnumbered." Viper's confidence shattered into a million pieces. His eyes darted wildly, desperately scanning the room for an exit, a weapon, any sliver of hope. But there was none. He had entered this building certain that he was the predator. In that moment, he finally understood he was the prey. Dominic's steps were deliberate, each one a hammer blow against the silence of the abandoned warehouse. He came to a halt right before Viper, standing so close he could smell the man's fear. The younger man's forehead was covered in a cold sweat. "You are at a crossroads," Dominic stated, his voice a low rumble. "There are only 2 paths forward. The first path is simple. You follow every instruction I have given you. You will bring back the money. You will deliver Tyler to me. You will make amends with the woman your animal nearly killed. After that, you will disappear from Chicago and never set foot here again. If you do these things, I will let you live." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "The second path is that you defy me, and then I will demonstrate precisely how I earned the name Reaper." The strength vanished from Viper's legs, and he collapsed onto the oil-slicked concrete floor. Every bit of his tough facade was gone. His hands shook uncontrollably by his sides. The serpent tattoo on his neck seemed to twist in agony as he struggled to swallow. "I will do it," he managed to choke out, the words thick with terror. "Anything you want. I will do it all. I swear to you." Dominic just looked down at him, letting the absolute dread take root in Viper's soul. "If you ever break this promise," he said with finality, "there is no place on this planet you can run where I will not find you. I will hunt you down, and the things I do to you will make you beg for an end that will never come." Viper could only nod, a frantic, desperate motion, as hot tears streamed down his cheeks. Before the sun rose, the black cobras were completely gone from the south side, erased as if they had never existed. Viper himself was gone from Chicago that very night, abandoning the empire he had spent years building. He would never be seen in that city again. But one piece of the puzzle remained, one more person who had to answer for his crimes. Tyler Ashford. They located Tyler Ashford cowering in a Greyhound station at 4 in the morning, his hand clutching a single ticket for a bus to Detroit. He never made it onto that bus. In the desolate parking lot, Dominic's people intercepted him, pulling him into a dark sport utility vehicle before a single soul could witness it. Tyler shrieked and thrashed and pleaded, but the vast empty night swallowed his cries whole. He was taken to a different warehouse on the west side, a place just as terrifying as the last. It was a box of windowless concrete walls. In the very center of the room, a lone metal chair was bolted securely to the floor. When Dominic finally walked in, Tyler was already strapped tightly into that chair, waiting. The man who had beaten Olivia Bennett to within a breath of her life was a pathetic sight. His normally arrogant face was ghostly pale, a disgusting mess of tears and mucus. His expensive designer clothes were now creased and filthy. He was shaking so hard that the heavy chair vibrated against the floor. Dominic positioned himself in front of Tyler and simply stood there, letting the oppressive silence amplify the man's terror. "Please," Tyler finally sobbed, his voice thin and reedy. "Please, there has been a misunderstanding. I am in love with her. I have always been in love with her. I never intended to hurt her. I lost my temper. It was just a mistake. One single mistake." Dominic's voice was completely devoid of emotion. "You call beating a woman until she is unconscious a mistake? I was drinking. I was consumed with jealousy. She was smiling at other men, and I just snapped." Tyler's excuses poured out of him, a desperate, jumbled torrent of words. "I love her. Everything I have ever done was because I love her." Dominic slowly crouched, lowering his face until it was level with Tyler's. The younger man recoiled violently, straining against his restraints, as if he could melt into the steel of the chair. "Love?" Dominic asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Do you believe love means possessing a person, cutting them off from the world, and brutalizing them until their own reflection is a stranger?" "She is my property," Tyler spat out, a sudden burst of his old self-importance cutting through the fear. "She belongs to me. She will always belong to me." The sound of the slap echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. It was so fast, Tyler never saw it coming. His head whipped to the side, and a spray of blood flew from his newly split lip. "She is not an object," Dominic's voice was like ice. "She is a person. She has the right to refuse you. She has the right to walk away. She has the absolute right to live a life free from the terror of the man who claims he loves her." That was what finally broke Tyler. He began to sob uncontrollably, his cries like those of a broken child. Please do not kill me. Please, I will do anything you ask. I will leave the city. I will never speak to her again. I beg you." Marco took a step forward, his hand resting calmly on the weapon at his hip. "Boss?" he asked, his tone professional. "What are your orders for him?" Every man in that room was certain they knew the answer. Tyler Ashford had harmed someone under Dominic's protection. Betrayal. The penalty for such an offense was always predictable. It involved a single bullet, an unmarked grave, and a name that was instantly erased from memory. But Dominic simply shook his head. A quick death would be a gift for this man. He stood tall, gazing down at the shattered figure slumped in the chair with an expression bordering on disgust. "You will continue to live, Tyler. You will spend the next 15, perhaps even 20 years, staring at nothing but four concrete walls. Every single morning, you will awaken in that cell and be forced to remember precisely what brought you there. Every single night, you will shut your eyes and see her face, the beautiful face that you completely ruined." Dominic then turned to Marco. "Get Detective Morrison on the line. Let him know we have a present for him. A complete package of evidence, including hospital records, detailed photographs, witness statements, everything he could possibly need for a conviction that cannot be challenged." 3 weeks after that day, Tyler Ashford was handed a sentence of 15 years in state prison for charges of aggravated assault, relentless stalking, and domestic battery. Dominic observed the news report from the solitude of his office, all alone. There were fates far more agonizing than a physical demise. To live with the crushing burden of guilt, with the inescapable consequences, with the unending weight of your actions, that was the truest form of punishment. Dominic understood this reality more profoundly than anyone. For 10 long years, he had been living with the searing pain of losing Sophia and Isabella. Some wounds are never meant to heal. They simply become an inseparable part of who you are. 6 months can truly change the course of a life. On a radiant spring morning, Lily Bennett burst through the doors of Chicago Children's Hospital, her arms outstretched like the wings of an airplane. Her feet, the very same feet that had once been cut and bleeding on the frozen city pavement, were now clad in bright pink sneakers that illuminated with each joyful step. Her infectious laughter filled the entire lobby as she twirled in delighted circles, putting on a show for the nurses who had so carefully looked after her. The operation had been an unqualified success. Dr. Chen had even called her recovery remarkable. The dangerous defect that had once cast a shadow over Lily's life was now fully repaired. Her heart was now beating with a strong and steady rhythm. She was finally able to run. She was able to play. She could finally be a normal 6-year-old girl for the very first time in her young life. Olivia observed her little sister from the hospital's main entrance. Warm tears were streaming unchecked down her face. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Absolutely everything had been transformed. On Madison Street, where a modest flower shop named Petal and Vine had once stood, a brand new sign now hung proudly above the door. It read, "Lily's Garden." The large windows gleamed in the bright sunlight, showcasing stunning arrangements of roses, lilies, and vibrant sunflowers. Inside the shop, the air was filled with the sweet fragrance of fresh blossoms and the scent of new possibilities. Dominic had purchased the shop for Olivia without ever seeking her permission. When she had attempted to refuse his incredible gesture, he simply placed the keys in her hand and walked away. "Just consider it an investment," he had told her. "I will be expecting a delivery of fresh flowers every Sunday." For the first time since she was a 17-year-old girl, Olivia was no longer working 3 exhausting jobs. She now worked just one, in her very own business, a place built with her own 2 hands and filled with all of her own personal dreams. On Tuesday and Thursday nights, she began attending classes at Chicago Community College, studying business management. Dominic covered the entire tuition. She finally gave up arguing with him about it after her 3rd failed attempt. The South Side had undergone a transformation as well. With the oppressive presence of the black cobras completely gone, the neighborhood began to slowly return to life. Shopkeepers who had existed in a state of constant fear now offered smiles and waved to one another on the street. Children could be seen playing outside long after the sun went down. The protection payments that had drained families of their resources were returned, every last cent, exactly as Dominic had commanded. Nobody was entirely certain what had transpired. Whispers circulated about a fierce war between rival gangs, about a mysterious and powerful figure who had swept through the area and cleaned house. But the people who lived there did not ask any questions. They simply cherished the newfound peace. A few of them began to call Lily their little angel, even though they could not fully articulate why. They just had a feeling that, in some way, that little girl with the bright eyes was connected to their deliverance. And every Sunday, without exception, a sleek black SUV would pull up to the curb outside Lily's garden. Dominic would emerge, carrying a bouquet of flowers for Olivia. They were always her favorites, always impeccably fresh, and he always brought a small bag of candy for Lily. He would often stay for several hours, sipping coffee, intently listening to Lily's exciting stories about school, and watching Olivia craft beautiful bouquets with hands that were no longer scarred and bleeding. Marco could not help but notice the profound change in his boss. The icy exterior had started to melt away. The formidable walls he had built around himself had begun to crack. Something unmistakably human was emerging from behind the Reaper's grim mask. "You have changed, boss," Marco commented one evening as they were driving away from the little flower shop. Dominic made no attempt to deny it. He just gazed out the window at the glittering city lights. The faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. Perhaps that is simply what occurs when a world of darkness finally discovers its source of light. The Sunday afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Lily's garden, looking like liquid gold. The small flower shop on Madison Street was officially closed for the day. But on the inside, 3 people were gathered together for their cherished weekly ritual. Lily was sitting cross-legged on the clean floor, surrounded by a rainbow of crayons and paper, the tip of her tongue sticking out in deep concentration as she focused on her newest artistic creation. Olivia stood just behind the counter, brewing a fresh pot of coffee in the compact machine Dominic had gifted her the previous month, and Dominic himself was settled into the worn leather armchair positioned by the window. He had a newspaper opened on his lap, but he was not actually reading it. Outside, the south side buzzed with a quiet, peaceful energy. Children were riding their bicycles along the sidewalk. Neighbors were enjoying conversations on their front porches. It was a world that had once been completely dominated by fear, but it was now breathing with a sense of freedom. Inside the shop, it felt like a home. Uncle Dom. Dominic lifted his gaze from the unread newspaper. Lily had set aside her drawing and was now staring up at him with her large brown eyes, the very same eyes that had looked up at him in the velvet crown all those months ago. "Yes, little one. I have a question for you." She crawled from her spot over to his chair and deftly pulled herself up onto its armrest, an action that Olivia would have normally scolded her for, but on this day, nobody said a word. "Why did you decide to save Liv?" The simple question lingered in the quiet air like a soft morning mist. Olivia's hands became perfectly still over the coffee maker. She did not turn to face them, but Dominic could clearly see the new tension that had appeared in her shoulders. He noticed the way she held her breath, anxiously waiting to hear his answer. He carefully set down the newspaper and looked directly at Lily, truly seeing her, noticing the healthy rosy color in her cheeks. He saw the brilliant spark of life that danced in her eyes. He saw the complete and total absence of fear in her small frame. She possessed no real understanding of what she had accomplished. She had no idea that her single desperate act of unbelievable courage had permanently altered the course of 3 separate lives. "Because someone reminded me," he answered slowly and deliberately, "that even a world of darkness is in need of some light." Lily tilted her head to one side, looking confused. "Who was it that told you that?" For the first time in 10 long years, Dominic Caruso smiled. It was not the cold, calculated expression he always wore for his business dealings. It was not the unfeeling mask he presented to the world. This was a real smile, one that was warm and genuine and just a little bit broken around the edges. "A very, very brave little girl," he said in a soft voice. She was only 6 years old. She had bare feet and was wearing a torn nightgown, and she did something that not one other person in the entire city possessed the courage to do. Lily's face wrinkled up as she thought about it. She sounds really cool. Do I know her? Dominic actually chuckled, a real laugh, a sound that was rusty from years of disuse, but it was completely authentic. You could say that. Olivia finally turned around, the coffee now forgotten. Her eyes locked with Dominic's across the cozy space of the small shop. And within that single, silent gaze, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged between them. Words of gratitude, of understanding, and of something far deeper that neither of them was quite ready to give a name to. For 27 years, Olivia had carried the belief that she was unworthy of any happiness, that her destiny was to struggle, to suffer, and to merely survive, but never to truly live. She had constructed walls around her own heart that were just as high as Dominic's. But in this moment, watching Lily laugh at something Dominic had whispered in her ear, feeling the gentle warmth of the Sunday sunlight on her skin, surrounded by fragrant flowers and the feeling of hope and the promise of tomorrow, she finally understood. She deserved all of this. All of them did. Sometimes the smallest hands are the ones that hold the greatest power to change absolutely everything. And sometimes, saving another person is the very way we end up saving ourselves. That was the tale of a little girl who ran for 8 blocks through the terrifying darkness to find a monster, and in his place, she discovered a guardian angel. It is the story of a woman who had spent her entire life feeling broken, only to learn that all the broken pieces can be reassembled in beautiful and unexpected new ways. And it is also the story of a man who was convinced he had lost his humanity for good, until the courage of a single child reminded him that it is never too late to choose love instead of fear. There are people in this world right at this moment, perhaps even watching this video, who feel exactly as Olivia did, completely trapped, utterly hopeless, and certain that nobody cares and that nothing is ever going to change. But if this story can teach us a single thing, it is this: help can arrive from the most surprising of places. True courage can reside in the smallest of hearts. And regardless of how dark your night may feel, the dawn is always on its way. If there is someone in your life who is struggling, please reach out to them. If you are the one who is struggling, please understand that you are not alone in this world. Your personal story is not finished yet. The very best chapters might still be waiting for you to write them. We genuinely want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel inside? Did it bring to mind someone special in your own life? Have you ever had a moment where the kindness of a stranger changed your entire day? We encourage you to share your thoughts with us in the comments section below. We take the time to read every single one, and your stories give us the inspiration to continue creating content that touches people's hearts and reminds us all of the fundamental goodness that still exists out there in the world. If this story had an impact on you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with a person who you think needs to hear its message today. Every single like, every share, and every subscription helps us to keep bringing you powerful stories about hope, about redemption, and about the unbreakable human spirit. Thank you so much for choosing to stay with us until the very end. Your time and your attention mean more to us than mere words could ever express. We wish you excellent health, true happiness, and a deep sense of peace in your day-to-day life. May you successfully find your own guiding light within the darkness, and may you find the courage to become someone else's light when they need your help the most. Please take wonderful care of yourselves and of each other. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories and valuable life lessons.